They never told you this part of the story, that in the summer of 1834, deep in the bayous of Louisiana, a white man built his fortune on what he called a miracle of the flesh. But what if that miracle refused to die? Imagine a boy, skin like frost, eyes like dawn, born into a world that feared anything that glowed too brightly. The townspeople whispered he was proof that even God had grown bored with color. But when the master began displaying him like a sideshow, the whispers changed. Animals stopped going near the barn where the boy slept. The mirrors in the main house began cracking without touch. And then, one humid night in 1834, the master's greatest attraction disappeared. No one spoke of it again, until now. Because what was buried that night didn't stay buried. Elijah Crane owned over 300 acres of swampy land in St. Helena Parish. He was a man obsessed with order, rows of sugar cane aligned like soldiers, the sound of chains in rhythm with his clockwork cruelty. When word spread that one of his slaves had given birth to a pale child, hair white as cotton, eyes pink, as firelight, Elijah saw not a curse but a business opportunity. He named the boy Samuel, and for years he paraded him to guests, calling him God's rarest experiment. The guests paid to see him. Doctors came from as far as New Orleans to prod his skin, test his eyes, and sketch his face. Samuel said nothing, not once. He was born on a night the sky refused to be still. The air over St. Helena Parish in 1834 was thick with heat and fear, thunder rolling far across the Louisiana cane fields like something alive. In the slave quarters, beneath a roof patched with tear and burlap, a woman screamed through her labor while the other women held her hands and prayed she'd live through it. The master, Elijah Crane, was inside the main house, irritated by the noise that broke his evening brandy and Bible reading. He was a man who prided himself on silence, silence from the workers, from the swamps, from his own conscience. But that night, silence had no place here. When the baby finally came, the room went so quiet it seemed the world had stopped breathing. The midwife dropped her rag. The others backed away. In the candlelight, the infant's skin gleamed like bone under milk. His eyelashes were white, his hair the same color as the cotton that had built the master's fortune. When he opened his eyes, they weren't brown or black or even blue. They shimmered red, soft and ghostly, like embers seen through fog. The mother, exhausted and terrified, pulled him to her chest, whispering prayers as though the words could cover him like cloth. She knew what this meant. In a place ruled by color, her child carried none at all. By dawn, word had spread across the quarters. The pale child, they called him. Some said it was a sign of bad luck, others that it was proof the devil had finally walked onto the plantation in human skin. The older women crossed themselves when they saw him. The younger ones avoided the hut entirely. But the overseer, a man named Harlan, saw profit before blasphemy. He took the news to the big house, his hat in hand, trying to sound casual when he said, "Master, one of the women's birthed a strange one. Ain't like the others. White as chalk, sir, but it come from her belly, sure as I'm standing here." Elijah Crane did not believe him until he saw the child with his own eyes. He stepped into the dark, damp cabin, his boots sinking into the dirt floor, and there it was, a baby that looked carved from marble. The mother trembled, clutching him tighter, but Elijah reached out anyway, brushing a single finger across the baby's cheek. The skin was warm, soft, real. "God's curiosity," he whispered, half in awe. The women bowed their heads, thinking he'd strike the child dead right there. But he didn't. Instead, he smiled. For weeks, Elijah couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. He called in a physician from Baton Rouge, who arrived by riverboat and declared the boy a specimen of extraordinary rarity. They used words like mutation and miracle, words that made Elijah feel chosen. The doctor suggested he could exhibit the boy in the city, charge a modest fee for scholars and curious folk. Elijah did not yet say yes, but the thought rooted itself deep in him. He ordered that the boy be named Samuel. The mother was given no say. She died before the child turned one, fever taking her as quickly as the wind moves through cane. Elijah had her buried at the edge of the property and kept Samuel in the big house, not with the others. He insisted the boy wear clean linen, eat from porcelain, and sleep beneath mosquito netting. He said it was to preserve him. The other slaves knew better. The master was keeping his prize untarnished. Samuel grew fast, quiet, and watchful. The servants whispered that he didn't cry as an infant, only stared, wide-eyed and still, as if listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. When thunder rolled, he never flinched. When dogs barked, he only blinked slowly. Elijah, meanwhile, grew fonder by the year, inviting guests from neighboring plantations just to glimpse the boy. "Look at him," he'd boast, gripping Samuel's shoulder. "Pure as first snow. God's reminder that beauty can be born even in bondage." The visitors would murmur, half fascinated, half unnerved, and Elijah would bask in their awe. Soon he began to dress Samuel in white silk shirts and paraded him through the main hall like a rare bird. Sometimes he'd make him play the piano, though Samuel never seemed to enjoy it. Other times he'd stand him near the firelight and force guests to observe how the boy's pink eyes reflected the flame. There were wagers about whether the child was cursed or blessed. One preacher warned Elijah that he was playing host to a spirit unfit for daylight, but Elijah laughed, claiming his plantation had been chosen by Providence itself. In those years, the contrast between master and servant grew sharper. Elijah, once merely cruel, became feverish in his pride. He spoke of expanding his land, of inviting scholars from the north to study his gift. He even planned to commission a portrait, the albino boy of Crane Plantation. Samuel stood silently through all of it, his face unreadable. The servants noticed that animals shied away from him. The dogs growled softly. The horses refused to meet his gaze. When Samuel walked past a mirror, light seemed to bend strangely, as though the glass didn't quite know what to do with him. One humid afternoon, Elijah caught Samuel watching him with that same steady look he'd had since birth. Calm, piercing, unblinking. Something in the master twisted. "Don't stare at me, boy," he barked. Samuel lowered his eyes, but the image lingered in Elijah's mind long after. That night, unable to sleep, he poured himself another glass of whiskey and wandered down the hall to the boy's room. The moonlight through the window made Samuel's skin glow faintly against the sheets. Elijah reached out, almost tender, then pulled back. "You're mine," he whispered. "My proof." Samuel's breathing never changed. By the time the boy turned 12, the plantation workers had stopped talking about him altogether. Silence was safer. The white guests still came, though, the curious and the morbid. Some offered money to buy him, but Elijah refused every offer. He said Samuel was his treasure, his legacy. Behind closed doors, however, even Elijah's wife began to fear what lived under her roof. She said the child's presence made the walls colder, that she'd seen him standing in the garden long after midnight, his pale hair drifting like smoke in the wind. Elijah dismissed it as hysteria, though he himself had begun to dream of the boy. Dreams where Samuel stood at the foot of his bed, whispering words he couldn't remember on waking. And so, the legend began before any act of revenge ever took place. The legend of the child born without color in a land built entirely upon it. The living contradiction, neither black nor white, both property and phenomenon. Elijah Crane saw only opportunity. Everyone else saw an omen. The older slaves left offerings by the riverbank, handfuls of salt and crushed tobacco, hoping to keep whatever spirit followed Samuel from turning its eyes on them. When the fog rolled in from the swamps and hung over the cane fields, they said it was the boy breathing. Every day he lived, Samuel reminded the plantation of something they could not name. A balance unsettled, a natural order disturbed, and every day Elijah looked at him. He saw less of a boy, and more of an idea he could never truly control. The birth that had once felt like fortune now lingered like a question that refused to go away. What happens when the thing you own begins to look back at you, seeing not a master, but a man terrified of what he's created? By the time Samuel reached his 15th year, Elijah Crane's fascination had grown into something grotesque. What had begun as curiosity had hardened into control, and what had once been the boy's life had turned into a living display. The master's plantation, already infamous for its cruelty, now drew visitors for another reason. People came not to see the fields or the mills, but to see the boy with the pale skin who lived among slaves yet looked whiter than the master himself. Elijah fed that fascination like a man stoking his own madness. He told anyone who would listen that his plantation had been blessed by divine hands. He built a new room for Samuel, attached to the side of the main house. It had a high window and a polished floor, and Elijah called it the conservatory. It wasn't built for comfort. It was built for show. Inside, he placed a piano, a chair, and a single mirror. He made Samuel wear white silk shirts and pressed trousers, his feet bare so that visitors could see the purity of him. The boy was instructed to remain silent unless spoken to sit or stand exactly where he was told. When guests arrived, from New Orleans or Baton Rouge, Elijah would lead them there as if unveiling a prize. "This," he would say, "is my angel, born right here on Crane Plantation by God's mysterious hand. Proof that even among the darkest of souls, the Lord can create something pure," the guest would murmur, half in awe, half in discomfort. The men asked questions about his eyes, his hair, his blood. The women watched with uneasy fascination, crossing their gloved hands over their laps. Samuel sat quietly through it all, neither flinching nor speaking, his gaze steady and unreadable. He was 15, but his stillness made him seem older, almost eternal. On market days, Elijah sent word to neighboring estates that anyone willing to pay could see the Albino slave of St. Helena. Doctors, preachers, and men with notebooks came, sketching Samuel as if he were a specimen instead of a person. They described him as an aberration, a marvel, a curiosity of race. Elijah basked in their attention, parading Samuel like a relic. He built his pride upon the boy's silence, as though every quiet minute was proof of his own mastery over creation itself. But Samuel was not silent because he was broken. He was silent because he was waiting. He watched every gesture, every face, every lie spoken about him, memorizing them as carefully as a man counting debts. The others in the quarters sensed something beneath his calm. They whispered that when Samuel's eyes fixed on you, he saw not your skin, but your sins. Elijah's wife, Mary Ann, avoided the conservatory entirely. She claimed the room felt colder than the rest of the house, that the light never seemed natural there. When she complained of headaches, Elijah mocked her. "You're jealous," he said one night, his breath heavy with whiskey. "The boy draws attention that should be mine." But even as he spoke, he couldn't stay away. He'd visit Samuel late at night, carrying a lantern, standing behind him in the flickering light just to stare. Sometimes he'd make him play the piano until dawn, the same song over and over. "Do you know why I keep you?" Elijah asked once, his voice trembling between pride and fear. "Because you remind me that I control everything in this world, even the strange things, even you." Samuel didn't answer, but the master's reflection in the mirror behind him seemed to flicker. For a moment Elijah thought he saw Samuel's eyes glowing faintly in the glass, as though lit from within. He stepped back, shaken, then told himself it was only the lantern light. Still, he left the room quickly that night and didn't return until morning. From then on, strange incidents began to multiply. The piano keys would sound on their own when no one was in the room. Servants whispered that they heard humming from the conservatory at midnight, a low and steady tone that made the air vibrate. One afternoon, a visiting scholar dropped his pen and bent to retrieve it. When he rose again, he swore Samuel's chair had moved several inches closer, though the boy hadn't appeared to shift. Elijah punished the servants for gossiping, but never slept easily again. He convinced himself that Samuel's strange presence was proof of his exceptionalism. "It means God chose me," he said to his guests. "Who else could own such a wonder?" His plantation profits began to falter, but he poured what money he had left into keeping Samuel fed and dressed as though the boy were royalty. He sold off 2 mules to buy fine curtains for the conservatory. He even hired a painter from New Orleans to capture Samuel's likeness. The man arrived, worked for 2 weeks, and fled before finishing, muttering that the boy's eyes followed him too closely, that the light never behaved properly in that room. Elijah grew frustrated. He beat the servants more frequently, shouting that they had brought bad luck into his home. Samuel watched these outbursts without expression, but there were nights when his door would creak open, and Elijah would find him standing by the window, staring out toward the fields. The moonlight bleached his hair until he looked almost transparent. "What do you see out there?" Elijah demanded once, stepping into the room. Samuel turned slowly, his voice quiet but steady. "Everything you've buried," he said. Elijah slapped him hard enough to split his lip, but when he turned to leave, the door wouldn't open. The latch refused to lift. He tugged, cursed, then finally yanked it free with a splintering sound. Behind him, Samuel had gone back to staring out the window, blood trickling down his chin, like a thread of color that didn't belong. After that night, Elijah forbade Samuel to speak. He told him he would be seen but never heard again. He ordered the overseer to watch him constantly, though none of the men wanted to enter the conservatory after dark. One of them, a young field hand, claimed he saw Samuel's shadow moving, before his body did, stretching across the wall like it had a life of its own. Despite everything, visitors kept coming. Curiosity outweighed fear. They spoke of the boy in salons and drawing rooms, telling tales that grew more distorted with every retelling. Some said Elijah had found an angel and chained it. Others whispered that Samuel was the ghost of a murdered child reborn into servitude. Elijah didn't care what they said, as long as they paid, but behind his triumph, rot was setting in. His wife's health declined. The workers grew restless. The plantation itself seemed to resist him. Crops withered without reason. The mill's gears jammed. Nights grew louder, the hum of cicadas replaced by something more hollow, as though the swamp itself were whispering his name. Still, Elijah refused to see the pattern. He only saw Samuel, the pale reflection of his own power, and mistook it for control. He began hosting what he called evening exhibitions. By candlelight, he would sit guests in a semicircle and have Samuel walk the length of the room while Elijah spoke of divine providence and the perfection of God's oddities. Once, he made Samuel kneel while he read aloud from Genesis about man's dominion over the creatures of the earth. His guests clapped politely, but more than one left early, unsettled by something they couldn't name. Through it all, Samuel's expression never changed. His silence had become a kind of mirror, throwing Elijah's madness back at him. Those who worked the plantation could see it happening, the master unraveling one quiet night at a time. They said that when Elijah slept, Samuel stood outside his door, watching, that his eyes shone faintly like coals in the dark, and that each morning Elijah woke older, more hollow, as if the boy was drawing something out of him, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left but the spectacle he had created, and the echo of a voice he had forbidden to speak. The years that followed turned the plantation into a theater of quiet dread. The workers went about their labor with bowed heads, but something in the air had shifted, an unease that clung to the skin like humidity. They spoke in low voices, careful not to say the boy's name after dark. Even the cicadas seemed quieter, their endless hum fading whenever Samuel passed by. He had grown into a tall young man by then, his skin so pale that in certain lights he looked more like moonlight than flesh. The master's obsession had not waned, but what began as pride had transformed into something more desperate. Elijah Crane, once the image of Southern command, had started to fray around the edges. His hair thinned, his hands trembled when he poured his morning brandy, and the lines around his eyes deepened into trenches. He still hosted visitors, though far fewer came now. Word had spread about the strange plantation in St. Helena Parish, the one with the white slave who never spoke. Those who did come often left with stories they couldn't quite explain, mirrors cracking without cause, a smell of ozone that lingered in the rooms where Samuel stood, a feeling that the air itself bent around him. It began with small things. One evening, a pair of dogs chained near the stables started howling as Samuel passed. The sound was so piercing that men came running from the fields thinking someone was hurt. The dogs threw themselves against their chains, frothing, snapping, eyes rolled back white. Samuel stood still, expressionless. When Elijah arrived, furious and humiliated, he struck one of the dogs dead with the butt of his pistol just to prove control. The second animal refused to move for days, lying silent until it too died. Soon after, the house servants began complaining of strange reflections. A maid polishing the hallway mirror claimed she saw Samuel standing behind her, though he was outside tending to a cart. She swore his reflection smiled when she turned away. Another servant cleaning the conservatory said she felt someone breathing on her neck even though she was alone. Elijah dismissed it all as superstition, but at night he started locking his bedroom door. He told no one, but he too had begun to see things, just flickers at first, like pale light moving at the edge of his vision. The changes in Samuel were subtle but unmistakable. He moved more quietly, his gaze deeper, more knowing. His silence felt heavier, not the obedience of a servant, but the calm of someone who understood too much. Sometimes, when Elijah raged about the harvest or shouted at the overseer, Samuel would be nearby, just watching. The master would feel his temper die mid-sentence, as if something unseen had reached inside him and twisted tight. He started avoiding the boy except when showing him off, yet couldn't resist checking on him after dark, drawn like a moth to its own destruction. Marianne Crane, pale and sickly by then, began speaking of visions. She said she saw Samuel's face reflected in her teacup, hovering over her shoulder in her mirror, even shimmering faintly on the surface of bathwater. "He's everywhere," she whispered once to a servant before being shushed. Elijah scolded her for spreading madness, but her words gnawed at him. The plantation doctor claimed it was hysteria, though his visits grew shorter each time. When Marianne's health declined further, Elijah forbade her from seeing Samuel altogether, but it was too late. She said the boy was in her dreams now, standing in the fields with a lantern, waiting for her to follow. The whispers among the slaves grew bolder in secret. They said the master had broken something sacred by keeping Samuel in the house, that his whiteness was not a blessing but a warning. An elder woman named Ruth claimed she had seen a pale shadow walk the fields at midnight, stopping by the unmarked graves where the punished were buried. She said it was counting. "Every soul he took," she muttered. "That boy's remembering them." Others began leaving bits of food and salt at the edge of the woods, offerings to whatever watched them now. Then came the night the storm rolled in from the Gulf, black and electric. The wind howled through the cane brakes like a chorus of voices. Inside the big house, candles flickered, though there was no draft. Elijah was pacing the study when the first mirror shattered, a clean, perfect crack from top to bottom. He cursed, thinking it the wind, but then came another and another. Every looking glass in the main house broke within the same breath. The servants screamed. Elijah stood frozen, listening to the soft chime of falling glass like rain. When silence returned, he found Samuel standing in the doorway of the hall, the stormlight flashing across his pale face. The boy didn't speak, didn't move. Elijah shouted for him to get back to his quarters, but Samuel only tilted his head slightly, as if hearing something distant. Then he turned and walked away, leaving muddy footprints that didn't match the size of his bare feet. From that night forward, the plantation stopped feeling alive. The crops yellowed before harvest, the well water turned brackish, and the horses refused to pull the wagons past a certain field. Elijah called for priests, for scientists, even for a spiritualist from New Orleans who charged an absurd sum. None stayed past sundown, each one left with excuses and trembling hands. Elijah's authority began to crumble as his men deserted. His eyes grew hollow, sleepless, and his temper became unpredictable. Some nights he'd stumble through the quarters with a lantern, demanding to know who was spreading curses. Other nights he locked himself in the conservatory, whispering to the empty piano as if it would answer. The strangest part was Samuel's demeanor. He never resisted orders, never fled, never struck back. But he stopped pretending to be what Elijah wanted him to be. When guests visited, he didn't avert his gaze anymore. He looked straight into their faces, and they faltered under his eyes, as if seeing something that reflected not beauty, but truth. One visitor left muttering that the boy looked more alive than any of us. Another said he could hear a faint humming whenever Samuel breathed, like wind trapped inside glass. Elijah's last shred of composure began to unravel when his wife's condition worsened. Mary Ann's fever raged through the humid nights, and she began speaking Samuel's name, over and over as if it soothed her. When she died before dawn one morning, Elijah found Samuel already standing outside the bedroom door, barefoot, hands folded. The master's grief twisted instantly into rage. "What did you do?" he demanded. Samuel didn't answer. Elijah struck him across the face, but the boy didn't move or flinch. For the first time, Elijah felt afraid of his own creation. He dragged Samuel outside, shouting that he'd destroy whatever unholy thing lived in him. The sky above boiled with thunder, the air thick with rain. Samuel stood still while Elijah raised his whip, the lightning flashing behind him like a crown. When the storm finally broke, the slaves in the quarters heard one sound carry above the thunder, a single scream, long and raw, then silence. Next morning, Samuel was found alive but unmoving in his cabin, his face calm, eyes open. Elijah said nothing about what had happened that night, but those who saw him afterward noticed his hands trembled when he lifted his glass. The marks from the whip that should have scarred Samuel's back never appeared. After that, Elijah began, drinking heavily, muttering to himself that the boy was watching him, even when his eyes were closed. He claimed the mirrors whispered. He smashed them all one by one, but said he could still see Samuel in the shards, staring from angles that didn't exist. His servants avoided him entirely. In the silence that followed, Samuel walked the plantation, like a ghost, barefoot in the mud, untouched by time or weather. Wherever he went, the air seemed colder, and the shadows stretched longer than they should have. The plantation had turned against its master, though he still pretended to rule it. The cane no longer grew straight. The workers no longer sang. The land had gone quiet, except for the sound Elijah swore he heard when the wind was still, the faint hum of the piano in the conservatory, playing by unseen hands, keeping time with his unraveling mind. At night, the plantation was a place of contradictions. The air smelled of magnolia and iron. Lanterns swung gently on the veranda, casting honey-colored light across the gravel path where slaves knelt in rows, waiting for the next command. Among them was a figure who didn't fit. His skin reflected the firelight like polished bone, pale, almost translucent. His eyes, a faint gray blue, caught the flames and returned them with quiet defiance. They called him Silas. But on nights like these, when the master's guests arrived from New Orleans or Savannah, he was not a man. He was an attraction, a curiosity, a living spectacle meant to astonish those who paid to witness something unnatural. Silas was born from a woman who had been bought and sold 3 times before she ever turned 20. His father, no one dared to name, but everyone knew, the master himself. The albino's skin was proof enough, and the master, perhaps out of shame or perverse pride, refused to sell him. Instead, he became the plantation's secret display, a thing the master would show to friends after dinner, laughing at their disbelief that such a creature could exist within his own fields. They said Silas's skin glowed under moonlight, that his veins looked like thin silver threads when the firelight caught them. Women shuddered, men smirked, and the master smiled, basking in their awe. But beneath that spectacle, something dark was growing. Silas learned early that he was both protected and cursed. The overseer, Carter, a man with a face like granite and a temper that broke bones, hated him for the privilege he carried. While other slaves bled under the whip, Silas was kept clean, his hands rarely blistered, his back unscarred. He was the master's showpiece, his proof that he could breed even nature into submission. Yet every kindness Silas received was laced with humiliation. When guests asked if he was real, they would force him to stand on the table, turning his face toward the candlelight as though he were some divine experiment. They'd trace his arm, comment on the lack of color, call him Ghost Boy or White Shadow. The master would laugh, pouring bourbon, declaring, "A miracle of God's mistake." But there was something the master never understood. Being touched like that, being looked at like that, planted something far deeper than pain. It planted a kind of silence that turned into vision. Silas began to see things others ignored. He noticed how Carter looked away when the master drank too much, how the mistress trembled when the parlor door closed late at night. He learned to move soundlessly, to listen. Every cruelty made him sharper. Every insult refined his calm. And when his mother died in the summer of 1838, buried behind the tobacco sheds without a marker, something in him shifted entirely. No one saw him cry. No one saw him speak of it. But 3 nights after her burial, the master's prized stallion was found dead, its throat slit, its white coat painted red in the torchlight. The overseer said it was wolves. The master cursed the wilderness, but Silas watched from the shadows, his eyes reflecting the lantern flame, and said nothing. It was the first whisper of revenge, small, silent, unnoticed. But it wouldn't stay that way for long. The plantation's slaves began to whisper stories about Silas. How he could walk without leaving prints, how animals followed him in the woods, how his voice could quiet storms. Some said he spoke to spirits, that his mother's ghost had returned through him. Whether it was superstition or fear, those whispers reached the master, who began to worry that his prized curiosity might turn from attraction to omen. The more the guests marveled, the more the master drank, and the more he drank, the crueler he became. He began forcing Silas to perform tricks for visitors, balancing glasses on his head, reciting Bible verses he didn't understand, even letting men test his skin with needles to see if he bled the same. One evening, a guest from Charleston asked if Silas could be branded, just a small mark, to prove he was truly flesh and not spirit. The master, eager to please, ordered. The iron heated. Silas didn't flinch when it touched his shoulder. He only looked straight ahead, the smell of burning flesh rising between them. The men laughed nervously. The master smiled, proud of the spectacle he'd created. But when Silas lifted his head, his eyes were no longer submissive. They were calm, empty, patient, like something that had already decided. After that, night, strange things began to happen. The master's hounds, usually loyal, refused to go near Silas's quarters. The overseer claimed he saw him standing in the field at midnight, motionless under the full moon, whispering to the ground. The mistress began waking to the sound of chains rattling outside her window, though no one was there. Workers complained of crops dying in perfect circles, as if something underground was poisoning the roots. The master dismissed it all as slave superstition, but in his sleep he began to dream of pale hands reaching through the soil. By autumn, Silas no longer hid his defiance. He spoke less, worked less, yet no one dared punish him. The other slaves followed him quietly, looking for guidance. Carter, the overseer, warned the master that something's coming. The master laughed, calling him a fool, but his laughter sounded thinner now. He didn't notice the way Silas watched him, the way his gaze never blinked when the master's back was turned. The plantation's nights grew colder. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. On the night of the harvest celebration, when the house was filled with guests and the smell of roasted meat, Silas was ordered to appear once more. For entertainment, he stood before them, silent, bare-chested, the faint scar from the eye, brand glimmering in the light. The master raised his glass and declared, "Behold, even nature obeys my hand." The room erupted in applause, but then the candles flickered. The hounds outside began howling in unison. A wind tore through the open doorway, extinguishing every flame. In the darkness, the first scream came from the parlor. When the lights returned, the guest from Charleston lay on the floor, eyes open, throat cut. No one saw Silas leave. No one heard a door open. The master shouted for his men, but all they found was a trail of white ash leading toward the fields. That night, fires burned in the distance. Barns, stables, the overseer's quarters. The slaves vanished into the woods, led by a figure the moon seemed to follow. When dawn came, the plantation was gone. The master's greatest attraction had become his undoing, his pride, his punishment. Those who survived claimed they saw Silas walking through the smoke, untouched by flame, his skin glowing like ivory against the ashes. Some said he disappeared into the river. Others swore he was still there, beneath the soil, waiting for the next man who would try to own the unnatural. No one ever rebuilt the plantation. Travelers avoided the land, saying the ground itself hummed on moonless nights, a sound like breathing, slow and patient, waiting for someone to listen. When the fire died down and the sun finally rose over the ruined plantation, the earth itself seemed scorched with memory. The fields were nothing but blackened stems and smoke, and yet, among the ruins, one thing remained untouched: the master's house. The walls still stood, tall and proud, though the windows were shattered and the air inside smelled of blood and burnt oil. The master, Samuel Hargrove, staggered through the debris with trembling hands. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, his clothes torn. Everything he had built, everything he believed he owned, had vanished in a single night. The slaves were gone. The overseer was gone. His wife was missing. And the only trace left behind was a strange mark carved into the parlor wall, the shape of a circle, intersected by two lines, drawn in ash. He recognized it instantly. It was the brand he had burned into Silas's shoulder months earlier. But here, it wasn't a scar. It was a message. It was as if the mark had come alive and written itself back upon his house. He felt his throat tighten. His greatest curiosity, his living proof of superiority, had not only defied him, he had marked him in return. The authorities from Charleston came 2 days later. They found the master sitting on the veranda, staring into the fields. His lips were dry, his eyes vacant. When they questioned him, his words came in fragments. White fire. The wind spoke. She was smiling in the doorway. They assumed madness. But when they went to the parlor, they too fell silent. The air felt heavy there, as if the walls remembered what had happened. The smell of smoke lingered. But beneath, it was something faint, something metallic, like old blood. Inside, on the dining table where Silas had once been forced to stand, lay a single object, the master's branding iron, still warm. But the iron had changed. Where it once bore his initials, S.H., it now bore something else, a perfect circle carved deep into the metal, the same symbol that haunted the wall. The sheriff ordered it removed, but when a deputy reached to touch it, he recoiled as if burned. His hand blistered within seconds, though the iron had not been in flame for hours. The men left quickly after that, muttering about curses. No one wanted to stay the night. As word spread through the county, the Hargrove plantation became something whispered about, not spoken of. Travelers avoided the road that passed by its gates. Locals said they saw pale figures moving among the trees or heard faint singing from the riverbank, a woman's voice, low and sorrowful. Some said it was Silas's mother. Others said it was Silas himself, calling the dead back to life. But one man, Reverend Elias Crow, refused to believe the superstition. He was a scholar of faith and logic, and he traveled from Savannah to document what he called the tragedy of Hargrove's madness. He arrived with notebooks, quills, and a mind ready to disprove every whisper. When he met the master, he found a man hollowed out by fear. Samuel's hands shook as he poured whiskey, spilling it over his fingers without noticing. His voice was weak, but his eyes were wild, like someone watching a fire only he could see. Crow asked what had truly happened that night. The master leaned close and whispered, "He came back for what I took." The reverend pressed him to explain, but Samuel only laughed, a cracked, desperate laugh that chilled the air. "He wasn't born wrong," he said. "He was born right. The rest of us were wrong." That night the reverend stayed in the guest room. The house creaked, like something breathing in its sleep. Around midnight, he heard a soft tapping. slow, deliberate, coming from beneath the floorboards. He followed the sound to the parlor. The fire had long gone cold, but the ash mark on the wall seemed to shimmer faintly, as if pulsing. He knelt beside it, running his fingers over the grooves. The ash smeared easily, but underneath it, the wood had darkened in the same circular shape, as though burned from within. He stepped back, unsettled, and that's when he saw it. A footprint in the dust by the door. Bare, thin, the outline of toes. He rushed upstairs to wake Samuel, but the master's bed was empty. The window stood open, the curtains fluttering in the night breeze. On the pillow lay a strand of white hair, fine as silk, almost glowing. The Reverend searched the grounds by lantern light but found only the faint echo of movement in the trees, like whispers carried by wind. At dawn he found Samuel by the river, half submerged, staring into the water. His lips moved soundlessly, repeating something over and over. "He's not gone, he's not gone." The Reverend left that morning, pale and shaken. In his notes, later discovered years after his death, he wrote of what he believed to be a manifestation of guilt made flesh, that Silas, the albino son, had become a vessel for the sins of his father and the land itself, that his suffering had awakened something older than either faith or law. He was not cursed by his skin, Crow wrote. He was chosen by it. The white was not the mark of weakness. It was the color of reckoning. Weeks later, the plantation burned again, this time completely. When a passing merchant saw the smoke and alerted the authorities, nothing but black soil remained. No bodies were found, no traces of struggle. Only the iron symbol, half buried in ash, now cold. The ground around it, however, refused to grow anything for decades. Farmers who tried said their cattle avoided the field entirely, circling it, in wide arcs as if guided by instinct. By the 1860s, locals called the place the White Field. Old slaves who escaped through those parts swore they could see a figure walking there on moonlit nights, tall, pale, calm. Some said he guided the lost toward the river crossing, ensuring they reached freedom. Others said he haunted the men who still traded in flesh. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. Every man who tried to claim that land afterward met with disaster. Crops failed. Fires broke out. 2 owners went mad within a year. The last one simply vanished, leaving his horse and coat at the gate. Historians later dismissed it all as folklore, a ghost story born from guilt and fire. But a few letters, preserved in the Charleston archives, told a different story. In one of them, dated 1844, a plantation wife wrote to her sister, "Sometimes I dream of him, the man with white skin and eyes like smoke. He stands by the river and whispers my name. I wake to find ashes on my hands." Those who have studied the case say that Silas's revenge wasn't a single act. It was a slow unraveling of everything the master had believed immutable: property, blood, ownership, even death itself. He had become more than a man, more than a slave. He had become the echo of justice, the quiet, patient kind that waits until the guilty are alone and then reminds them what they've done. And though time buried the plantation beneath trees and moss, the land never forgot. Travelers still say that when the fog rises over the river, you can hear a faint voice singing, low, calm, neither joyful nor sorrowful. Some say it's Silas, still walking the fields that once caged him. Others say it's the earth itself, humming the memory of his vengeance. Years passed, and the legend of the albino slave became part of Southern folklore, a whisper traded around campfires and in back rooms, where men drank too much and dared to talk about the things that should have stayed buried. But behind every version of the story was a trace of truth, and that truth had a way of resurfacing in strange, unsettling ways. In 1872, a historian named Dr. Adrian Locke arrived in South Carolina, traveling by carriage with a single goal: to document the lost plantations of the antebellum era. He was a Northern academic, a man of science and reason, who believed the Southern ghost tales were little more than cultural residue from the war. Yet when he came across mention of the White Field in an old county ledger, something about it caught his attention. The record was oddly incomplete. It listed the land as Hargrove Estate, but beneath the description was a handwritten note. Condemned, not to be surveyed. Do not disturb the ground. Curiosity overcame him. He found a guide, an older freedman, named Josiah, who had once worked on nearby plantations. When Locke asked about Hargrove, Josiah's expression changed. He lowered his eyes and muttered, "That land don't rest easy, sir. Ain't been right since the white boy came back." Locke laughed it off, assuming it was superstition, but Josiah refused to go near the site after dark. Still, he agreed to lead him there, at least to the edge. When they reached the field, the air changed. The forest that surrounded it seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no wind. The soil itself looked pale, covered with a thin layer of white, dust that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Locke knelt to touch it and found it cold, even though the air was hot and heavy with humidity. The trees around the clearing twisted inward, their branches resembling black fingers pointing toward the center. It was there that he noticed a faint depression, the remains of a foundation perhaps, where the plantation house once stood. He began to dig, carefully, methodically. Josiah stood back, whispering prayers under his breath. After a few hours, Locke uncovered the edge of what seemed to be a cellar door, burned and warped by fire, but still intact. Against Josiah's protests, he pried it open. A rush of cold air escaped, impossibly cold, like winter trapped underground. He held his lantern high and descended the stone steps, the flame flickering violently as if resisting the air around it. The cellar was small, filled with debris and the remnants of old wine barrels. But in the far corner, something glimmered, a small iron circle, buried halfway in the dirt. He brushed the soil away and froze. It wasn't just a circle. It was the same symbol, the one described in Reverend Crow's journals, the brand, the mark of Silas. Only now it wasn't just carved into wood or metal. It was fused into the stone itself, as though melted there by something hotter than fire. As Locke stared at it, he felt the temperature drop further. The lantern dimmed, its light swallowed by the shadows that seemed to pulse around the mark. He told himself it was lack of oxygen, fatigue, imagination, but then he heard it. A faint sound, distant yet close, like a breath taken too slowly. Then another. Then a whisper. A voice not in his ear, but in his head. He couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm, measured, deliberate, echoing the slow beat of his own heart. He stumbled back, knocking over the lantern. The flame flared, then died. Darkness swallowed everything. In that instant, he saw it. A shape forming in the corner, pale and still, standing where no one had stood in decades. It didn't move toward him, but the air seemed to fold inward, pressing on his chest. The whisper came again, clearer now, carrying words he couldn't deny. He marked me first. Locke scrambled up the stairs, his hands clawing at the edges, until he burst into daylight. He collapsed onto the soil, gasping, his skin clammy and his vision swimming. Josiah rushed to him, eyes wide. "You saw him, didn't you?" the old man said softly. Locke didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked down at his wrist and saw a thin line of white, a small, perfect circle burned into his flesh, cold to the touch. He left the field that day and never returned. But in the weeks that followed, he began to change. His colleagues noticed his complexion growing paler, his eyes lighter. He dismissed it as exhaustion, but within a month, he couldn't bear sunlight without pain. He wrote frantic letters to fellow historians claiming that something ancient lives in that ground, not spirit, not ghost, but memory made flesh. His final note, written before he disappeared entirely, contained only one line: "I understand him now. What remained of Locke's journal was found years later, hidden in a library archive in Charleston." The handwriting grew increasingly erratic, the ink often smeared as though written in trembling hands. The later entries blurred the line between study and confession. He wrote of dreams where he walked through the white field, hearing chains drag softly behind him, and saw pale figures tending crops that no longer existed. He claimed the land, hungered for remembrance. that it called men like him, men who sought to expose it and consume them until they became part of its silence. The story spread quietly among scholars and travelers, always retold with skepticism, but never entirely dismissed. A century later, in the 1970s, an archaeological team attempted to locate the Hargrove estate. They found traces of the foundation, charred wood, and fragments of ironwork. The site's soil analysis revealed unusually high levels of lime and calcium, enough to whiten the earth over time. The scientists called it a chemical anomaly. Locals called it something else, the stain of the ghost boy. Yet every attempt to excavate the area failed. Equipment malfunctioned, batteries drained without reason. Workers complained of nausea, disorientation, even hallucinations. One man swore he saw a figure standing by the tree line, white as smoke, watching. Another claimed to hear a voice humming a tune that didn't belong to this world. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Hammond, left the project abruptly after one night alone at the site. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "The land doesn't want to be touched." After that, no one returned. The forest slowly reclaimed the clearing, though the ground remained pale and barren in the center, a perfect circle of silence. Today, satellite imagery shows it clearly. A strange scar on the landscape that never changes, never greens. Some say the soil still breathes faintly on cold nights, releasing mist that curls like smoke from unseen embers. Those who live nearby warn travelers not to stop there, especially when the moon is high. They say the air turns colder. The sound of footsteps echoes even when you stand still, and if you listen long enough, you'll hear the same words that haunted Locke's final moments. He marked me first. And somewhere beneath that earth, beneath centuries of soil and silence, something waits, not out of anger, but out of memory. Because some stories don't die. They just change shape, wearing new faces, new names, until history itself becomes the ghost, and the truth is the only thing left that won't stay buried. Time has a way of softening horrors, of turning even the darkest atrocities into stories fit for textbooks and museums. But the tale of the albino slave never softened. It refused to fade into legend. It remained sharp, cold, and alive, moving from generation to generation like a curse passed through the roots of the land itself. And though people stopped speaking his name, they could never quite silence him. Because every few decades, the same pattern returned. A pale figure seen where no one should be, strange marks appearing in the soil, whispers of retribution that sounded too deliberate to be coincidence. By the early 1900s, the region surrounding the old Hargrove estate had been repopulated by poor tenant farmers. They built small shacks on the outskirts of the forest, never venturing near the clearing they called the Circle. But even they knew to speak softly when the fog rolled in from the river. The elders said that was when the White One walks. The new generation laughed at the superstition, but laughter tends to die quickly in the dark. One of those farmers was a man named Henry Cobb. He was a widower, raising 2 children alone, struggling to work the stubborn land. He didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but he noticed things he couldn't explain. At night, his oxen refused to cross the ridge that bordered the white field. His youngest son, Caleb, began waking in tears, claiming that a man with light eyes stood outside his window humming songs that made the walls shake. Henry dismissed it as nightmares, until the night he heard it too. It was faint at first, like the hum of wind through glass, but soon it deepened, filling the air with a sound that wasn't music, yet wasn't silence. He stepped outside, shotgun in hand, and saw the fog curling low across the field, pale and thick as milk. In the center of it, something moved. Not walking, but gliding, slow and deliberate. Henry's heart froze. It wasn't until the figure turned that he saw the face, white skin, eyes that reflected the lantern light like liquid mercury. The figure didn't come closer. It only raised its hand and pointed toward the ridge. Then it vanished into the mist. The next morning, Henry found the ground disturbed where the figure had pointed. A section of the soil had sunk in, revealing the edge of something buried. Metal, circular, engraved. He brushed away the dirt and found it. the brand, the same mark that had haunted that land for nearly a century. He didn't know what it was, but the moment he touched it, the metal burned his skin. He dropped it instantly, his palm seared with a perfect white circle. Within days, his health began to fail. Fever, trembling, visions. He claimed to see faces in the walls, pale hands reaching from the floorboards. His neighbors found him one morning sitting on his porch, staring at the horizon, his eyes clouded white. He was alive but wouldn't speak. They moved him to Charleston, where doctors called it catatonia. But when they examined his hand, the circular scar glowed faintly under lamplight, as if something inside the flesh was alive. Henry never recovered. His land was abandoned once more. Over time, reports of strange phenomena increased again, travelers losing their way near the field, compasses spinning wildly, animals avoiding the area. In 1934, a group of university researchers arrived to study what they called a magnetic anomaly. They brought instruments, cameras, notebooks. They were scientists, rational, grounded, but their notes told a different story. One entry, written by a graduate assistant named Lewis, described how the air seemed to vibrate at certain times, producing a low-frequency sound that made their bones ache. "It feels," he wrote, "like the ground is humming, like it remembers." Another entry from the same night mentioned a light in the fog, pale, human-shaped, stationary, but aware. Within a week, their instruments began failing. Batteries drained instantly. Their film came back overexposed, as if saturated by unseen light. They left in silence, refusing to publish their findings. By the mid-20th century, the white field had become a place of avoidance again. The county paved a new road that curved around it entirely, cutting through thicker forest just to avoid crossing its edge. But the stories continued. A pale figure standing in the mist, soft singing echoing from the river, crops that refused to grow near the soil. Each generation renamed the story, but its shape never changed. The locals said the same thing every time. He comes back when people forget what was done there. In 1968, a journalist named Clara James traveled to South Carolina to write an article on haunted lands of the South. She was young, fearless, and skeptical. She wanted to prove that the tales of the Whitefield were nothing but relics of guilt. She spent 3 nights camping by the edge of the clearing, documenting her experience. Her notes, later found in her car after she disappeared, described how each night grew colder, how the mist began forming earlier, how she heard faint footsteps circling her tent though no one was there. On the 3rd night, she wrote something different. Her last entry read, "He isn't haunting, he's remembering. He's showing us what we refuse to see." That was the final line. Her tent was found torn open, her camera shattered. The ground around it was covered in fine white ash. No body was ever found. After that, even the bravest avoided the place. Locals built fences around the perimeter, nailed wooden crosses into the trees, and stopped speaking of it entirely. But silence doesn't erase a wound. It deepens it. The stories only moved underground, whispered by old men in gas stations, or murmured by children when they dared each other to walk past the ridge. Modern times didn't erase the legend either. In 2010, a drone survey of the forest revealed something startling. The outline of a human figure burned into the ground itself, visible only from above. The arms outstretched, the head tilted upward, facing the river. No machinery, no footprints, no evidence of tampering. The soil in that exact shape was bleached bone white, while everything around it grew dark with moss. Experts dismissed it as a natural phenomenon, chemical leaching, maybe lightning strikes, but locals knew better. They said it wasn't new. It had always been there, just waiting for technology to finally notice what the earth had been trying to tell them. And still, when asked about it, they said the same thing their ancestors had said. The White One doesn't rest. Not until the land remembers. Those who live near the area today still speak of cold spots and strange lights, though they rarely elaborate. Travelers who stop at the nearby gas station sometimes notice the clerk's uneasy smile when they mention the name Hargrove. If they press, he just shakes his head and mutters, "You don't go near the circle." Not even at noon. Some say that the field isn't haunted at all. It's alive, a living record of what humans tried to erase. That Silas's revenge was never about blood, but about remembrance, about forcing the world to face what it built on pain. His spirit became the conscience of the land, and the land never stopped whispering his name. When fog settles low over the trees and the night turns unnaturally quiet, those who listen closely swear they can still hear it, that same low hum, rising from the soil like a heartbeat. It's steady, patient, eternal, a sound not of hatred, but of history refusing to die. And when the mist shifts just right, they say you can see him standing there, pale, calm, unburned by time, watching the living, reminding them that what's buried in the dark never truly stays there forever. If you've made it this far, you've seen the truth most people were never meant to know. History hides its darkest faces behind polished portraits and gilded words. But beneath every story of power lies one of silence, cruelty, and vengeance. Stories like this remind us that justice doesn't always wear a crown or carry a gavel. Sometimes it moves quietly in the dark, waiting for its moment to be seen. If you felt something, anger, sorrow, unease, that means the past has reached you. And that's the point. These stories were buried for a reason. The question is, why? Who decided which parts of history we're allowed to remember and which ones we must forget? Every week we uncover another forgotten truth. Stories of the enslaved who defied their masters, the rulers who feared their own secrets, and the moments that rewrote humanity's darkest pages. So if you want to keep seeing what the textbooks never dared to tell, subscribe now. It costs nothing, except your comfort. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next descent into the shadows of history. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what part of this story haunted you most? Was it the silence of those who watched, or the vengeance of the one who refused to stay invisible? Your voice keeps these ghosts alive. Subscribe, comment, and remember, the past isn't dead. It's only waiting for someone to listen.